Greetings. I am your host, leader, creator, co-adventurer, and co-poet for this trans poetry bias training, uh, Jack Jan Giesking. I'm just going to call myself Jack. Um, and this video is part of the Hearts-Based Education and Anti-Colonial Learning Project that's funded by the Indigenous Services Canada, otherwise known as a HEAL grant. This is clearly made for specifically Canadian healthcare professionals, but we are of the mind that it would be great for people all over the place to see this and experience this. So why a bias training through the lens of trans poetry? Understanding trans people takes time, and any trans person would tell you it took a long time and is a forever process of learning and understanding yourself. And a significant amount of that comes through your health and to the medical community. As you sort out your identity, your body, your gait, your voice, your hormones, your organs, so many things to sort out and figure out who you are. And the best way to do that is through truly deep listening. And when it happens and it rises, empathy, um, and tapping into that part of yourself takes time. And so this specific version of the Heal Grant is going to use poetry as a medical humanities form of a different kind of listening to yourself, to other people. And you do not need to be a poet. Like I love a disclaimer. You absolutely don't need to be a poet. I've set this up for people who are not poets. I should be very clear that when I say I'm a poet, as I like button this up nervously, I have just started to publicly identify as a poet myself. I am actually secretly Dr. Jack King, and my PhD is in psychology. So I hope that makes you feel more comfortable. I'm an environmental psychologist, which is how people relate to and define their sense of space and place. Space and place relate to and define us. And I haven't actually been writing or thinking in psychology. I have been a leading expert on queer and trans geographies for over 15 years now. I wrote a book called A Queer in New York, Geographies of Lesbians, Dykes, and Queers. It's the first lesbian history of New York City. Just came out, which is horrifying, right? We just got one. It also has a lot to do with trans, queer, bi experience, clearly. And all along my whole life, I have loved poetry. There was a significant poem about a kite that flew so high in the sky in second grade that perhaps galvanized who I am today. Yes, I hope you think I'm being funny because I really mean it. And I really did write that poem, and I have been writing poems ever since. I'm a huge fan of poetry. Now, what about trans poetry? Is that a thing? You're like, what's going on there? So there are, I do want to say there are books about poems by trans poets. I'm gonna show you them right now. So the first, how did he do that? It's magic. Pause and record. So the first book is that I found about trans poets was called Subject to Change. It's actually going to be the first book that we use in these three modules. So there'll be three modules with 4 parts each. I'll explain that in a second. But I found this book, Subject to Change, which has 6 trans poets who are transgender, a couple of their poems, a handful of their poems, and then an interview with them. And I love interviews with poets because I find that when I read them, I'm like, is that what you meant? So it really takes away any kind of nervousness I have. The other, and I should let it go because sometimes I forget what my poems mean, and maybe I should rewrite the poem. But another great book we'll be using is Sleeping on the Wing, that doesn't contain any poets in it that we know to be trans, but it's definitely an incredible book that's going to help us understand what is poetry, how we can be chill and engage poetry. Um, and there are some books that came out, and that's really important. And I think it's really important for trans poetry, especially to be okay with being yourself, which is a journey. I think we can all agree to that. The first book, this is quite a tome. Like, are there trans poets? Yes. This is the old book, Troubling the Line. The new book, the big book, is We Want It All. This book sold out immediately in first printing, and I don't even know what number it's in. But you can see all the names of the poets on the back. And if you want to look up more poetry by trans people, I recommend these books. I recommend something you're going to get Subject to Change for this course. But there are a lot of texts out there, and you are super welcome to get them. You don't have to. The one you're going to need is Subject to Change. So why exactly am I doing this if I'm sort of always been a poet, but mostly a geographer? Well, I spent 10 years specifically collecting data, besides writing this book about a queer New York. I spent 10 years collecting trans Tumblr data, by which I mean I grabbed every hashtag under the sun that trans people, trans femme, so people who are trans and feminine in their identities, trans women, or trans femme people, they might not identify as women or trans women, and trans masculine, trans men might identify as men, people shared about themselves, um, and did social network analysis, mapping, text analysis about this data. And I also found out that it was truly overwhelming to do this research, especially when I was unsupported in my own trans identity. But what was amazing about it, and the data still exists, and somebody else I think will write about it soon, is that it is packed full of medical information. It's how I found my doctor. He was a hashtag, and for my own top surgery. And it's how people exchange information. This is what it looks like a month on hormones. This is what it looks 6 months. This is what it looks like in weeks. And you see after a year, people tend to go off. They're like, by kind of in myself, right? So it's a continual churning engine, or was, of this amazing information. Nowadays, that the NSW, not safe for work laws, really shut down and deleted a lot of that data, though some of it's come back onto Tumblr. What gender is this nipple, right? There's an AI engine, deleting nipples of a certain gender that they call a certain gender. And as a result, trans people have gone to Reddit, to TikTok, to so many other places, and they've always been on YouTube. In fact, we'll be using YouTube in this bias training so that you can experience like how people share and think about medical knowledge. But in this lovely experience together, you're also going to learn a little bit about poetry. And poetry is really helpful for seeing things and saying things, putting things into the world that have space and are short and brief, and a glimpse, and a connection. It also gets you to know your voice a little bit more. It's about storytelling. It's about metaphor. And gosh knows that doctors and nurses and PAs and MAs and phlebotomists and all the medical kids in the yard have so much to deal with. And it's a lot to ask you to also be so human with us when you have heavy loads and your own lives and you're in your own heads and doing your own things. And how do you engage with trans people? In fact, the third book we'll deal with, in the third module, is this book, Trans Medicine, The Emergence and Practice of Treating Gender. And I just want to say, there's a wonderful line that I want to give you a shout out here when you're like, I don't know anything about trans people. You know what? I didn't used to either, and I am one. Okay, so there's this how do medical providers know they are making the right decision in the face of vast uncertainty? I don't know. How do you do that? This is a question that frequently comes up for providers of trans medicine and others working in new or not well understood areas of medicine, along with uncertainty stemming from the novelty of trans medicine. Many providers shared they had never met a trans person. Hello, until they walked into an exam room. Well, we're not there, but and were startled to realize the person before them was trans. Well, gosh, let's not let that happen, right? Let's ground you. Now, before we go on, I've showed you the 3 books that you're gonna need. The trans medicine. This, do I look professorial with all my? Yes, I have was also a professor for 15 years. Um, uh, these are the 3 books you're going to need. They'll be in your syllabus. And you might be saying, hey, what's the structure of this thing? I love an introduction to a structure. So there's 3 modules, and each module has 4 parts. Each part is about 10-ish minutes. I'm going to set a timer for all of them, except for this one, so because we're covering the intro, and there's one where I got long. And in each part, that's about 10-ish minutes. Long was 18 minutes. So each module is less than an hour of tape. The first part will be an introduction to what we're doing when we're doing it. And we're going to talk about, I'm going to leave, since we're introducing the whole series, I'm going to leave the introduction to this module to part 2 this one time. In part 2, we're going to talk about the kind of trans materials you're dealing with. Because if you've never engaged with trans people, you don't know a lot of trans people. If you are trans and you don't do poetry, if you're a poet and you don't do trans things, I want to give you a kind of material, a text, something to contend with, to connect with. And in the third part, I'm going to teach you a kind of a poem to write. It is low key, low stakes. Nobody's going to look at your poem. I will show you my poems at the end, and we'll see what you think about those. In the fourth part of each module, I will walk through how to write the poem. I'll give you guidelines. Some of you will hear those guidelines and say, I would rather call my face off. You'll be a small group, probably, because I find that anytime teaching poetry, people like the first to stick to something that guides them. You're your own person, right? I mean, it's a whole thing about being your own person, respecting that. So I get that. But I also encourage you to write a poem in the structure I give you, because it's kind of fun to try that out. And what else? You'll write a poem and I'll give you some reflection questions. You can write them down. You can do an audio script. And you can write your poems in the margins of a medical textbook. You can put them on gum wrapping paper. You can keep a poetry notebook that's beautiful and pristine, and it says, my name, poetry notebook, right? Whatever makes you happy. Now, last but not least, you might say, I don't know what top surgery is. I don't know what trans is versus transgender versus transmass versus transfem. Weren't we using F to M and M to F? We don't use those words anymore. They mean female to male, male to female. Do we say transsexual? What about transvestite? All those things. There are books for that. I'm not going to go into it. This is my favorite. It's so cheap. This was $12. The Trans Allyship Workbook. There's actually a couple. There's one just on pronouns. I will give you a highlight from that. And this is building skills to support trans people in our lives. This is probably one of the most taught, most purchased of all time resources in every country that speaks the languages it's been translated into, about connecting with trans people and understanding trans people. It's got all your language in there. What I love about the pronoun guide, which is like tinier and not even, I don't think it's $10. The pronoun guide, which came out first, had this wonderful story. And so I'm gonna leave you with this story, so that you can say, whoa, we're all growing. And instead of interviewing people, they found a bunch of trans people who somebody in their lives didn't use their pronouns. And it was stressful and hard for them. It always is, because it's not being recognized as yourself. And oh my gosh, you guys have to deal with all those forms. And what name do I call them? And where is it in this? Where did they put it in the Epic record? I'm assuming you guys have ever. Ooh, stressful for us too. And anyway, this trans woman hated her job, never uses my pronouns, doesn't respect me, boss doesn't respect me. And she says, she tells the authors this, and the authors, instead of interviewing the trans people whose pronouns people don't use, they actually go to the people who they work with and say, or people in their lives, like their parents, and say, hey, why don't you use their pronouns? Could you just tell us? We're wondering. And so the boss says, ugh, she doesn't do her work. Drives me nuts. And the authors say, huh, what does that have to do with her being trans? Boss says, good point. Starts using her pronouns. She starts showing up for work. Best performer ever. So, right, we don't know how this works. We kind of get frustrated and annoyed, and we have been taught a lot of horrible things about trans people. The media you see, the news you see lately. Yeah, and we'll touch on some of that too. And of course, I send greetings and didn't start with this because I'm nervous and excited. So I apologize that I send greetings and gratitude from lands of the unceded and stolen lands, from the unceded stolen lands of the Wakamtuk peoples and the Wabanaki Confederation, which is known as Western Massachusetts. It is very cold here, and I hope wherever you are, it is warm enough, but not too hot. Take good care, and away we go.